My name is Dr. Rebecca Clark, and today we'll be talking about the differences in work environment and work engagement as moderated by psychological capital. The purpose of this study was to determine if and to what extent there was a difference in the overall work engagement of instructional designers who were working either predominantly at home or predominantly in the office in the United States. And the secondary purpose of the study was to examine the moderating effect of psychological capital on the predictive relationship between work environment and work engagement. There are two theoretical frameworks that support the study. The first is work engagement. Research has shown that work engagement has a positive influence on work outcomes and employee well-being. This study contributes to existing research by providing evidence on the work engagement of instructional designers as it relates to their work environment, and evidence of the influence of work environment on engagement. The study provides a key contribution to existing literature by offering significant evidence that work engagement is different for those who work predominantly at home and those who work predominantly in the office. The second theory is psychological capital, which has been shown to be effective in managing challenges and increased job demands. Research has shown it is state-like and may be affected by various organizational contexts. This study extends existing research on type of work environment, psychological capital, and work engagement by assessing the type of work environment as an antecedent to work engagement and examining the effect of psychological capital as a potential moderator of that relationship. It also highlights the importance of understanding the influence of organizational context on an individual's psychological capital. The four frames identified here defined the problem space for this study. First, Shake and Macheka 2019 pointed out that the mechanisms driving engagement in virtual teams were not fully understood. Golden and Gajendran in 2019 stated that it is not known how engagement is affected based on how much time a person spends working virtually. Toth et al. In 2020 recommended more research to understand how personal resources, like psychological capital, affect the work engagement of knowledge workers. And lastly, it's important to understand work engagement of instructional designers based on their increased job demands due in part to the coronavirus pandemic. The approach to this study included the problem statement, which is, it is not known if and to what extent there is a difference in the overall work engagement of instructional designers who are either working predominantly at home or predominantly in the office in the United States, and whether that relationship was moderated by overall psychological capital. The target population was instructional designers in the United States. At the time of data collection, the size of the target population in 4 instructional design groups on LinkedIn was more than 87,000 members. The methodology was quantitative, using a prospective causal comparative design with an additional correlational predictive moderator analysis to account for a moderation effect. The first research question for this study was if and to what extent does a difference exist between types of work environment and work engagement for instructional designers. The results illustrate that there was a statistically significant difference in work engagement scores between groups. The work engagement scores for those who work predominantly in the office were statistically significantly higher than those who work predominantly at home. As shown in the population pyramid charts, starting at an aggregate work engagement score of 2.0 and down, there's a heavy output from those working predominantly from home and very little for those working predominantly in the office. However, for aggregate work engagement scores of 5.0 and up, the opposite is true, with a heavier population for those working predominantly in the office and a lesser population reflecting high work engagement scores for those working predominantly from home. Essentially, this means that the higher the work engagement score, the greater the difference grew between the two groups, with a larger number of high work engagement scores for those working predominantly in the office. The finding was unanticipated, but could be explained by Kang and Busser's 2018 suggestion that there are numerous contextual factors to consider even though work environment may nurture work engagement. At the time of data collection for this study, many organizations were transitioning back to working in the office after coronavirus pandemic restrictions had been lifted in mid-May of 2021. This could have been a motivator in terms of how the sample responded to the survey questions. The second research question was, to what extent is there a moderation effect by psychological capital on the predictive relationship between types of work environment and work engagement for instructional designers? Despite issues of heteroscedasticity and multicollinearity, the moderated multiple regression test using the Hayes process macro was sufficiently robust to yield valid results to answer the second research question. While interpreted with caution, the results of the regression analysis model were significant, indicating that approximately 82% of the variance in work engagement is explainable by type of work environment and psychological capital. These both significantly predicted work engagement conditional on the other predictive variable equaling 0. To answer the second research question, however, the results of the intercept needed to be inspected. The predictive relationship between type of work environment and psychological capital was not statistically significant in the model, suggesting that psychological capital was not a significant moderator of the effect of type of work environment on work engagement, accounting for less than 1% of the variation of work engagement. The results of this study do not provide evidentiary support indicating that psychological capital moderates the relationship between an individual's type of work environment and work engagement. This outcome does conflict with similar findings in previous research. Duplessis and Boshoff 2018 found that psychological capital both mediated and moderated the relationships between authentic leadership and work engagement in their cross-sectional quantitative study of 647 managers in a South African healthcare organization. In two separate studies of high school students in the Philippines, psychological capital was shown to be associated with and to be a predictor of autonomous and controlled motivation, as well as academic engagement and achievement, according to Datu et al. 2018. Engaged employees were shown to use positive organizational behaviors like psychological capital as coping tools to help them manage a dynamic virtual work environment and demanding situations. While this does not appear to be the case based on the results of this study, other authors in the current literature have reported findings similar to this study. The theoretical implications of this study on the concept of work engagement is that type of work environment is a significant organizational factor related to an individual's work engagement, and there are differences based on an individual's type of work environment. This supports Baker et al.'s premise that job resources such as the ability to choose one's own work environment enabled work engagement and were better predictors of engagement than job demands. It is anticipated that the study would extend research related to psychological capital by providing evidence for the value of developing psychological capital because of its potential moderating role in the relationship between work environment and work engagement. While the results from this study did not show psychological capital to be a moderator of the relationship between work environment and work engagement, the findings reinforce the positions of those who have argued that psychological capital may be influenced by organizational contexts. The findings of non-significance does not bear any theoretical information, but it does highlight the criticality of understanding organizational context as an influence on psychological capital. There are 3 recommendations for future practice for organizational leaders and human resource practitioners. First, knowing that there are differences in work engagement for employees working at home or in the office, organizational leaders and human resource practitioners should design flexible work practices in a way that accommodates the diverse needs of employees based on their type of work environment. A second recommendation is for organizational leaders and human resource practitioners in the learning and development industry specifically. It would be prudent for learning and development department heads to allow their instructional design staff to choose the type of work environment where they feel they will be most effective. This recommendation is in line with Spivak and Woodside 2019, who noted that intrinsic work motivation is likely to influence work environment choices. Individuals who have high intrinsic motivation, specifically knowledge workers, are likely to prefer and choose work environments that help their productivity. And lastly, while this study did not show psychological capital to be a moderator of the relationship between work environment and work engagement, it's clear that work environment and positive psychological capital have a positive conditional effect on work engagement. Therefore, human resource practitioners should consider contextual factors that may influence an individual's work environment, as well as establish programs to develop their psychological capital. Thank you for your time.